It's Wednesday, August 12th, and this is Reel in the Field Goals presented by the Ballard Agency. This is week 2 of our sponsorship of the Ballard Agency, a family-owned and operated business for over 50 years in Kirkland, Washington. So if you need insurance and, especially if you're a business owner, like a contractor, craft brewery, startups, technology firms. Dan, you like craft breweries?
Oh, I love craft breweries, definitely.
And if you were going to start a craft brewery, you would need insurance, right?
Yes, you would.
We've talked about recently how difficult it is to start a craft brewery. It's something that you're interested in yourself, right?
Yeah, it's something that my friend and I thought about doing it for about 2 years. We used to brew like 2 or 3 times a week. All grain, like from scratch, we did everything. And so we definitely did a lot of research into the brewing business, and it's definitely, insurance is important in that one, but it's important in every business, really.
I mean, if you were going to actually go do all that work to start up a business and put in tens or if not hundreds and thousands of your own money, dollars, then you would want to spend a little bit more to make sure that it's insured. And if you're in the Seattle area, somewhere in Washington, the Ballard Agency, located in Kirkland, is a great place to get going, and they sponsor Field Goals, so I like them for that reason. What about you?
Yeah, that makes them way cool in my book. And
I think so.
Way cool.
It's way cool. Maybe we'll pitch them that as their tagline. The Ballard Agency.
Great idea.
Way cool. Definitely if you need even personal insurance, they're a broker for many of the top-rated insurance companies in the Washington area. So go to ballardagency.com or call 425-454-3510 and tell them that Field Goals sent you so they know that these ads are working. And then we can keep on getting sponsored and bring you better shows in the future. And as for the Seahawks talk today, we're going to be talking about training camp, but specifically we're going to be talking about preseason week 1, the Denver Broncos. It's seems like an annual matchup that they put up against the AFC West here in the preseason. And we're playing the Broncos this Friday at 7 o'clock p.m. Pacific time on the NFL Network. And one of those players in that game to keep an eye on, wide receiver / cornerback. That's right. He's playing both sides of the ball. Wide receiver / cornerback Douglas McNeil is on the show today. He talked to us, and stay tuned for that later in the show. An exclusive interview with Doug McNeil III, and really hoping that he makes the team. Danny, any quick thoughts that you have about that talk we had with McNeil?
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting talk. He was very insightful. Sometimes you have to it's like pulling teeth with players in terms of getting them to speak about their situation and what they're going through. But he was definitely very insightful, and so it's an interview that I thought was really good. I thought he was a great interview, so I think people are going to like it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were on the same page. When you asked him questions like about technique and stuff, he was on the same page, picked it up and gave us really nice answers about what it's like to play for Pete Carroll and the coaches. And also on the same page when I asked him stuff like, what's your favorite place to eat in Portland? So, the important questions that people want to know. And again, if you guys, the more you guys listen, the more we can go around telling agents and stuff like that they should have their players right here on Reel in the Field Goals. So, tell your friend and use our sponsors, and more of those interviews to come in the future. Let's start talking about the Seahawks. They're going to be seeing what kind of players they have this season in the preseason to see who's going to make the final 53-man roster, considered to be one of the best, if not the best team in the NFL. So not an easy roster to crack. But every single season, there's a couple guys that didn't get much of a chance in, April, May, June, July, and then end up making the final roster. This week, Danny Kelly wrote his second edition. Is that right?
Well, it's the first preseason edition. I can't keep track of how many I've done. I did one earlier in the off season, but we'll just call this 1.0 now that we have more information on what everyone's doing.
Right.
And I'm going to do one of these each week.
We know a lot more just from training camp, who they're putting out there on the ones the most often.
Yeah.
Especially with those offensive line positions. So, I want to ask you about a couple of these, the cuts that were difficult and some of the guys that made the roster. And let's just start with a guy that I think has become one of your favorite players, Thomas Rawls. I see you like him, and that's fine. I didn't know that much about him, but come to think of it, when you really dig into his history, this is a guy that 3-4 years ago, if you were talking about Thomas Rawls, you might have been talking about a first-round pick, right?
Well, yeah, because he started out as a big-time recruit. He started at Michigan and then ran into some trouble, ended up transferring and, kind of, like I said, ran into issues throughout his college career. So he fell off the radar big time, but he still was productive. I originally scouted him a little bit before the draft, and then, I liked what I saw. He was kind of one of those late-round guys that I thought could kind of fit the Seahawks style and personality, identity kind of thing. And then when they got him, I was pretty stoked. I thought, that's a really good undrafted pickup. He's a guy that could, really potentially make the practice squad. But now it's like almost like there's been so much hype now that I'm almost just like leery about it, because it seems like these overhyped guys almost always tend to get cut. So it's like you're stealing yourself from that eventuality. But yeah, I'm really excited to see what he does this week. Obviously, all 4 weeks. Like I've said in the past, you can't really tell much about running backs, honestly, in training camp, just because no one's hitting and the offensive line's not really doing what they normally would do during a game in terms of cut blocking and things like that. And so, I still don't think we have much information on him. I think obviously the hype is that looks really great out there, but it'll be great to see him put on the pads and really get going.
Why not Rod Smith? Wouldn't you think that maybe Smith brings such a different element to the table that if there was going to be a surprise, that it would be someone who does something that just seems a little different than all the other running backs on the roster, rather than maybe, or do you think that it's because Rawls could have an actual future as more of a 2-down back?
Yeah, I think, first of all, we talk about roster mirroring and how the Seahawks tend to like to have, when they have a next man up situation where someone gets hurt or whatever, and they have to have someone else come in, they don't want to have to change things up for that guy. They want to have a guy that essentially can do the same style of things athletically that the person in front of them can do. Obviously, the talent levels are going to be different from a starter to a backup, but in terms of the athleticism, size, length, things like that, the Seahawks tend to like it to do that roster mirroring thing where they have several guys that kind of look the same. So I think there's a part of that is why Rawls fits in. He's almost the same size as Marshawn Lynch in theory. And so with Rod Smith, I really do like Rod Smith too. I think, he was the guy who stood out to me on the first Friday practice that I went to. And, Pete Carroll's mentioned him. He's a little bit different. Like you said, he's more upright, kind of like different body composition. He's tall and a little more slender than the other guys. And I also just frankly think he'd be easier to stash. It seems like Rawls has gotten so much hype that you try and get him into the practice squad, it's probably not going to happen. He's probably going to get picked up by the Cowboys or whatever. So that was why I made that decision there.
Smith listed at 6'3". I can't even I almost wanted to make the roster just to see a quarterback stand next to his running back and have him 4 or 5 inches taller than the freaking quarterback. I don't think I've ever seen that before.
That'd be funny to have him and Will Tukuafu standing next to.
Oh my God, unbelievable!
Where are we going?
I think that Tukuafu has a future as a quarterback. Man, 6'4", 285. That's something that Wilson could maybe look up to and strive for. Was Derek Coleman the toughest cut or one of the toughest cuts?
I think he was one of the toughest cuts on this whole thing. And as I tried to explain in the article, really it's just because he can't stay healthy. And it's hard to make the team when it's that. I think it's still a pretty close competition. I think they love Derek Coleman because he's a stud on special teams, particularly. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's really hard to make this roster, especially if you're not going to be able to get into the game. And so he's had a nagging hamstring injury from what I've heard, hasn't really practiced lately. And obviously there's still, about a month left till regular season. There's only a few weeks until first cuts though. So he's got to get back out there and really start proving that he can be healthy and stay healthy. And so I think that was the main deterrent from putting him on the roster, was mainly that he just hasn't been able to be healthy. The other thing about that is, Will Tukuafu was a guy that was reliable last year. He got better as the year went on. It felt like he kind of learned like their blocking system and what he needed to do. And then I think there's also been talk that his versatility is so important because he can fill in as a defensive end if they want him to, in a pinch. Because you can only suit so many guys on game day. A guy that can play several positions is huge. They could play him as a third tight end in theory, just because he's kind of that size. Not necessarily as like a pass catching tight end, but like put him on the end and have him block on the move. I think that he's capable of doing that. And then also for Tukuafu, like in pass pro, he's like the size of like a small tackle. So putting him on the edge, if that's their protection, where you have a running back or fullback matched up against a guy who's coming off the edge, like that's kind of a nice thing for the Seahawks because, he's got 4 inches and 40 pounds on Coleman. And so, when you're going up against an outside linebacker, that's a big deal.
It's interesting that after this, just knowing how much Pete Carroll likes, to try new things and, isn't afraid to, copy like stuff that works in other teams and everything with the guys switching sides. It's interesting that there hasn't been sort of like a J.J. Watt or I'm having a hard time figuring out another one, but a guy that catches touchdowns from like the defense, just because of his size disadvantage. Do you think that there's anybody on the roster that could sort of fill that role of, being a size disadvantage up on the 1 or the 2 yard line?
Type of guy that would come on to the offense from defense? Yeah, I think, one guy is Cassius Marsh. He caught a couple touchdowns for UCLA, and he was primarily a defensive end for them, but he is, let's see, I'm trying to look at how big he is. I think the last time they talked about him, he's in the 250-pound range. So he's the size of a tight end. He's 6'4", 255 or so.
Right.
So yeah, and from what I've heard and what Pete Carroll said is he's got good hands. So he's the kind of guy who could also fill in as an emergency tight end, like if they really need that. Obviously, the only reason you'd really probably do that is if you wanted, or if like Jimmy Graham was injured, or if Luke Wilson got hurt or something, and they needed some depth there. But I don't think they have any like freakish athletes that really fit into the J.J. Watt mold in terms of let's throw him a fade route off from the 1 yard line and have him dive and make a catch. But JJ is just a freak. So
even just like thinking about, the whole roster, and we were talking about Rod Smith, if everybody is really the height that they're listed at, that would make Rod Smith at 6'3" taller than every receiver on the team except for Chris Matthews.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy.
Which they could have had anybody. They're going undrafted free agents. There's no reason for them to necessarily go after a guy that's 6'1", 5'11", 5'10". They could just get some project 6'4", like they did one with Chris Matthews, but it just seems do they really not value height, or they just haven't found the right guy?
In terms of receivers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's mostly the latter. I think they just haven't found the right guy. Like Pete Carroll's talked about how when you get to be a certain height, generally speaking, you're just not as fast. And I mean, we had talked about last year, like how the Seahawks didn't really, their receiver, I don't know for sure how accurate it really was. I think they did. I think a few of them were able to separate pretty well and get open, quote, get open. But I mean, if you're talking about a guy who's 6'4", 6'5", they're generally just not as quick. And so they can't get open as well. And I think Pete Carroll's talked about that in the past where, but at the same time, now they've got Chris Matthews. They tinkered around with our guest today and Doug McNeil, and depends on where he lands, if he's on the offense or defense. But, he talked about this today, Pete Carroll did. And when you got a big guy outside, they tend to look open because to a quarterback. And so, you get more of those jump ball situations where the quarterback is willing to throw the ball because just because of their size, they're able to go up and get the ball. So that's something that he did a lot at USC. That's something that we've talked about a lot here in Seattle, but it hasn't really happened a lot. But frankly, they just haven't really invested in a guy like that anything more than, some of these project type guys. So, I just think it's mostly the supply and demand of those players of that size is really small that can move.
Yeah.
They generally tend to go like early rounds, and the Seahawks just haven't really gone there.
Right. Let's talk about the wide receiver group. And, I think you got 4 guys that everyone pretty much expects to be there, with Chris Matthews sort of, I guess, solidifying his place, maybe just because of his Super Bowl performance, maybe because of his, as we said, size advantage, like significantly. He's just different than every receiver on the roster. But Kevin Norwood and Kasen Williams, you have both of them making it. And then Ricardo Lockett, again, not making the roster, BJ Daniels, and then a couple long shots, Kevin Smith and Deshaun Fox. You didn't have to necessarily keep Kasen Williams. You could have gone 5 receivers.
Mm-hmm.
What was your thinking behind that one? Because as we were saying with Thomas Rawls, again, a guy who, had a lot of potential 3 years ago and then fell off for various reasons. Obviously, his injury as a junior sort of ruined everything. But if he's back to the way he was as a sophomore, I mean, does he have potential to be one of the better receivers on the team?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way his career was going, I don't know if he was necessarily going to be a first-round pick, but he was talked about as top couple rounds at that point in his career. And then obviously he got hurt, and that sapped him of. I mean, that was just a devastating injury, like totally effed up his lower leg, his foot, and so those are obviously the plant points for a guy, and he's a pretty big player. So, he lost a lot of his speed and explosiveness, and I think it's taken him a couple of years to get that back. And just the way that they've talked about him, the last couple, days and weeks, is that he's looking really good out there now. It's one thing to do that in training camp practice, and it's another to do it on the field. And so this is why he was kind of one of my wild picks for this first roster prediction. And we'll know a little bit more after the first couple games, whether that's kind of a pipe dream or if it's actually going to happen. But in the past, I mean, the Seahawks have gone with some of their, lesser known guys in favor of draft picks, or in favor of guys that they think, maybe have a higher or a ceiling, but they haven't gotten there yet kind of guys. And so I just think that it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up sneaking onto the roster as the last guy. And the other thing is, it's kind of like a running joke for Field Goals readers, is that I've cut Ricardo Lockett the last 3 seasons, and he always makes the team anyway. So I kind of just kept with that.
It's weird for me, not being a Huskies fan, just having gone through this with a couple other players, where it's I think to me, Huskies fans, they have an inordinate amount of love for these guys. And then because I'm a Cougar fan, or just because I'm not a Huskies fan, have an inordinate amount of dislike for their love, not necessarily the player, just the fact that I think I'll be you're so wrong.
Right.
There's no way Jermaine Kearse will ever play an important role in this team. And then he does, of course, catch some of the biggest passes in team history. Notwithstanding that I still think he's a 3rd or 4th receiver, but I guess that's the weird things with Kasen Williams. But maybe it's not fair to compare just because they went to the same school and had an injury and it knocked them out of the draft. But just in general, injuries would concern me. But in a specific case, looking at Chris Polk, who everyone was a great running back, and then the injury thing knocked him out of the draft, and then people were like, well, that's going to be a steal. And after 3 seasons, he's still in the league, which is great, but hasn't played a role really.
Yeah.
For the Eagles, and now he's going to get maybe a shot with the Texans. Arian Foster's hurt. Just in general, do you think injuries? What would your take be in terms of guys whose stock falls because of injury?
Well, I think in general, there's a reason guys like that go undrafted, because I think the odds are stacked against you. But and that's part of the reason the whole Casey Williams thing for me is kind of like my wild card pick, is because it's just one of those ones where it's like, if he can get back to the level of athleticism that he had as like a sophomore and coming out of high school, where he was like a 5-star recruit, and I think he was the top receiver in the nation in terms of his ranking, and if he can get back to anything near that, then that's just like, then you have a great 4th, 5th option in terms of receiver. But I'm not expecting him to come out and be a 1 or, blow up and like be like live up to his first round, whatever, anything like that. I have tempered my expectations, but I think in general you want to play it really safe with these guys, because most players that fall out of the draft due to injury probably end up not ever doing anything in the league, and that could be what happens with Case. And he could not even, he probably won't even make the roster, and maybe he'll be a practice squad guy, and that'll be kind of like, I think that would be a more conservative guess for this year. But I decided to kind of go for it just based on what I've been hearing about, how he'd been playing, the fact that he was scoring touchdowns, which I think Pete Carroll, loves. You want a touchdown maker, a guy who's going to make plays. And that's kind of what Jermaine Kearse has been, kind of a playmaker. Like, he's not steady Eddie. He's not reliable 100% of the time, but he has a knack for making these big game-changing plays. And so, that's potentially what they could get from Casey Williams. And so I just think it's kind of one of those things where you try and turn a guy into a diamond in the rough, and people always love that storyline, and I'm a sucker for it too. It really doesn't have anything to do with him being at UW. Like, for me, it was more just like looking at his his 5-star rating coming out of high school, and the same deal with Rod Smith. He was a 5-star recruit to Ohio State, and then never ended up really doing much. To me, it's more looking at like potential, and then you can potentially find a steal here, and so that's kind of the more exciting thing.
For me, like, no matter what happens, let's say that he overcomes the injury, then when another guy overcomes an injury, I'll say, well, case in point.
Yeah, you should really definitely save that one for that situation.
I've got that one in the back pocket.
Put that one out. Yeah, exactly.
You've got to have puns prepared for every situation. Always. So moving on to the offensive line, obviously this is something where the last 2 or 3 roster spots, we might not have any idea until the day it happens.
Right.
Which of the 6 guys that you left off the roster was the most difficult?
The way that I'm looking at it now, I would say it'd be a toss-up between Kevin Milton. I'm not sure if it's Kevin or Kevon.
Yeah.
Kevin Milton and Terry Poole, I think, were the 2 guys that kind of pained me to cut those 2. But I only kept 9 because I ended up keeping 5 running backs. I only kept 9 offensive linemen. And I was basically just basing it on, and this is a terrible way to do it, but like training camp hype.
Right.
So, you heard about Christian Sokoley running with the 1s a few times. You heard about Mark Lewinsky kind of making some waves there as like a left guard. My locks, I think, are, the normal guys, Russell Okung, Bailey. Sounds like Nowak and Jean-Pierre. At least one of those guys is the lock, and then Gary Gilliam, Justin Britt, and J.R. Sweezy. So I think there's like 5 or 6 guys that have to fill 2 spots. And so that was kind of a tough decision. It's kind of interesting that Patrick Lewis is a little bit like left out in the cold, just because he was a starter for several games last year, and people, I think, expected a little bit more of him. But yeah, I guess Kevin Milton, he's been making some strides, and I guess he's been playing with the 1s a little bit too. So he's a guy to keep an eye on. Terry Poole's been playing some tackle. So I don't know if that, I think they're going to try and hide him and then put him on the practice squad.
Yeah, it could always be a thing where they actually like Poole more than they like Lewinsky or Sokoli, but he's just not ready. He's just not as and they would just rather keep him working on his technique or whatever, and probably maybe see him more as a 2016 player than a 2015 player.
Yeah.
On the defense, just I don't really I mean, I don't really know anything about D'Anthony Smith. Can you tell me about him?
He's a former third-round pick by the Jags. He's a small school guy, and I think I think, the Jags liked his athleticism, and then the Seahawks also liked that. And I've just heard whispers about him just from different sources that the team likes him. Again, I don't really know a whole lot about him. He's played a few games with the Seahawks here and there. He's kind of been around. I think he knows the system now, and so I think he would probably be the most likely guy in that group to be the fourth defensive interior lineman. And they could end up going with more than four or whatever, but that was kind of like how I cut it down. And especially with the way that they've been running nickel so much, as they can have some of these defensive end types play inside on nickel downs. And so when you're playing 60% of the time on nickel, I don't think you need as many of those big, space eaters. And so, it depends on what they do at that position in terms of numbers. But that was what I saw. I think McGill is kind of a practice squad type. They could probably sneak him onto the practice squad. I don't think Jimmy Staten's really shown anything. Not that he's had as many opportunities, because I think he was injured last year during the preseason. But that obviously, my opinion of him could change after this week and after the next couple of weeks. So,
you kept 7 linebackers. Is that a numbers thing, or did you squeeze in one more? What would be the normal number, and which guy was like? Is there any one of these guys that you think would be the first man out? Because I think with like maybe Mike Morgan or something like that, you might just feel like there's a higher upside with Eric Pinkins.
Right. And that's the thing, is you have to balance like upside versus readiness. And Pinkins is so new to outside linebacker. He's made a switch just this offseason. Whereas Mike Morgan has been playing in strong side linebacker in the Seahawks defense since he was probably like 18. He played at USC under Carroll. He's been with the same system for, his whole career now. I think he's into his 4th or 5th year. So
yeah.
To me, I think they really like Mike Morgan, and I almost see him as more likely to make the team. I think they could probably stash Pinkins because, teams are less apt to take a guy who just switched positions, because that does say something about a guy, right? Like,
right.
He's not working out at this position. Let's see how he looks here. And so,
but then isn't there always like the little bit of a risk that when the Seahawks drop a guy, someone will pick him up just for the sheer fact that he's been working with the Seahawks, like especially within the NFC West.
Yeah. And I think Dan Quinn's going to probably gank a few of our guys. But I mean, that's the nature of how this works. So that's kind of like the churn thing. That's the volume drafting philosophy, is like cream rises to the top. And I think if there is one linebacker who goes, it'd be Pinkins. So yeah, that would be what I would say for that. I think they like Pinkins like tools a lot, but I don't think he's necessarily ready to go into a game at this point. And so Morgan's proven over the years that he can be like a reliable backup, and he's a core special teams guy. So that double dip is important for Morgan.
In the secondary, there's been a lot of, chatter one way or another about Ty Smith. So what do you think about him so far, and why did you keep him over maybe someone else?
Well, I think it comes down to him and Mohamed Cisse and potentially Douglas McNeil, and maybe one of those 3 will stand out in the preseason. I ended up keeping 5 safeties, which they may not do that. That might be a little high. But again, it was kind of going on camp hype, like Dion Bailey did, making some plays. I think they got to keep Steven Terrell just because he's the main like free safety backup type for Earl Thomas. And then, Deshaun Shedd, he's been in the system several years. He's the main strong safety type, and he can also play corner and free safety. So he's made himself valuable. So essentially I threw Dion Bailey on there just because of the way also, he's played in the Pete Carroll system for obviously he wasn't playing for Carroll, but he's playing in the USC system that I think was pretty similar to what Carroll was running. And then they talked about how he kind of knows his run fits and things like that. And so that's good, and could potentially get him a spot on the team. And now my lineup here depends a lot on what happens with Darrell Simon, because I put him on the PUP list. He's not probably supposed to be there, but I'm just being conservative. And And, who knows, maybe the Seahawks will just decide they like their depth after a couple of games here, and then just decide to keep Simon on that PUP list for later in the season. But yeah, I think it comes down to Cisse and Smith, and then potentially McNeil, though McNeil is really raw. So I could see him being more of a practice squad type if they decide to keep him at corner. And that's another way that they could potentially hide him because, but yeah. So, I mean, I think McNeil's got a fighting shot for the roster, but it's going to be tough because he's got some pretty strong numbers in front of him.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of names in the group, basically. When you look at some of the other groups, there are not necessarily as many names that roll out as guys the Seahawks drafted or guys that have been around for a couple of years. But in the secondary, there's a good number of players that are locks, and then the guys that aren't locks, there are guys that were drafted like Ryan Murphy or guys that were just traded for like Mohamed Cisse. So
yeah.
It's a tough position to make, but at the same time, I don't know necessarily. We'll talk to McNeil. We'll have our interview with McNeil here coming up in a few minutes, but it's going to be tough for him to make the roster. And at the same time, based on the fact that he doesn't really, it's not like he was someone that was drafted. So not like he was someone drafted this year. It would be a harder time. He just was they basically just moved him, to cornerback. So it would be tough to necessarily see. He's someone that seems like could definitely pass waivers and make the squad.
I think the way that, he's only been on one other team. I don't think he hasn't put any tape out there in terms of as a receiver other than his stuff in the Arena League. And I think there's a strong chance the Seahawks could hold on to him, and I think they would want to. I could see him being a practice squad regular this year if he doesn't make the roster. But I think he's got an outside shot at the roster. But right now it's just not looking good just because of the experience factor mostly.
Yeah.
So
speaking of McNeil, today I wrote about a different strategy perhaps that I haven't seen utilized around the NFL, probably for a good reason. But I wanted to experiment and see what the roster would look like if the Seahawks started second and third string players, guys with potential against the Denver Broncos starters, guys that, are professional football players, because that's the only way you really be able to find out in some cases who you have that is a professional football player. But probably the one that if I was literally going to do it, I don't know that I would put Douglas McNeil out there starting against Demaryius Thomas or
right. You got to kind of worry about like their mental state of mind.
Right. Just getting torched and tortured over player of play. But at the same time, I don't imagine that Thomas or Sanders will be out there for more than one or two series.
Yeah.
But because this is the first week and because the game is so meaningless, it would be interesting to see some of these guys, go up against Denver's, one of the best teams in the league, go up against their ones.
Yeah.
Just in general of thinking of the strategy, what do you think were some of the good points about it, and what do you think are the challenges of doing something like that?
Well, I mean, I think obviously it would be great to see how they perform against starters. I think that kind of it's really tough to evaluate in the preseason because, like, by the time you get into the second half of the game, it's seriously like fifth string guys.
Yeah, and
so you don't really know what you're getting from like Kristen Michael, for instance. It's like, a little bit of fool's gold going on. And so I definitely like that idea. I don't know why they don't do that. Probably a tradition for one, and getting their starters reps against ones is probably important as well. I think maybe one way they could do it is mix in some guys like, throw in Casey Williams against the ones, throw in Kristen Michael against the ones.
Yeah.
You made a list of a starting lineup that you would put, and I think, maybe if they decided to put like 5 guys on offense and 5 guys on defense that basically have no experience, like that would be a way that they could kind of.
So if you picked 5 guys on offense and defense that you would want to see right now tested against the ones that probably won't make the Seahawks starting roster, but, are working to get their place on the team, which 5 guys would you choose?
I think Casey Williams would be a good one. I think Rashawn Allen, that would be another good one. I like the idea of throwing Gary Gilliam and Jesse Davis out at the tackle spots.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be really interesting. And then, I think if you're going to protect with, if you're going to protect those two tackles, maybe throw in Tavares Jackson in case. So I think those would be the 5 I would choose for offense. As far as defense, Frank Clark and Cassius Marsh, I think those would be two perfect examples of.
I would love to see. I think that's one that I really would love to see.
Yeah, for sure. And then Cisse, I think that would be a good one. And then the safeties, Terrell and Bailey. I think
they got to be out there.
Yeah, so I think again, you have to worry about kind of mental state of mind. I think some guys could be like, "Oh God, I'm gonna die," but or like if they get burned and they're like, "Do I suck?" But
right.
I think most of the time Carroll kind of goes for guys that don't really have that issue.
But being surrounded, like in those cases, like if those were the players, if you only picked 5, then you're talking about, now they're surrounded by Brandon Mebane and Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright and Bruce Irvin on defense, and they've got, a professionals out there on offense, so that they would be, you're always supported by your teammates in football with how talented they are. So it wouldn't be as difficult. And, again, just thinking, I'm really excited just in general to see how much, Frank Clark and Cassius Marsh are going to bring this season.
I think those guys actually could end up being a really big part of the defense.
Yeah.
Like I said, the Seahawks played, I want to say 58% of their snaps in nickel. So more than half. They're more nickel now than they are base defense. Mm-hmm. And these two guys could potentially factor into that rotation pretty highly. So and everyone loves pass rush, and Pete Carroll especially. Pass rush is so big that if they could be factors in that, and kind of like, Frank Clark got 5 sacks and Cassius Marsh got 5 or 6, that could be huge. They're potentially replacing like O'Brien Schofield or DeMarcus Dobbs or whoever, some of these guys that are like kind of just fill-ins. And if they're actually really like effective, that could be huge.
The funny thing is that on a team that has been so good for the last 3 years, they don't have like a 10-sack player.
Right.
Like not even like that's like good. We like it because it's round, but that's not even like that great at 10 sacks. And we don't even have a guy that gets more than 8 usually.
Yeah.
Which is fine, I guess, if it's working, but and they share a lot of snaps and a lot of the things, but it would be interesting to see. I thought, there was definitely a time when I thought Bruce Irvin would be an Alden Smith type.
Right. And, Bruce is another one of those wild cards for me this year. Like I hate getting too excited about it because the last couple of years have been a little bit disappointing in terms of his numbers, but I think he looked really good when I saw him at training camp, and I've heard a lot of good things about him since that. So he could be really good, and I think in terms of the sack numbers, they haven't had double-digit sack guys. They've had a lot of like with Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill. Those guys are like near the league leaders in pressures, but they for whatever reason just haven't been able to finish out the sacks. So that could just be like one of those anomalies. With the statistical anomalies. Plus, I think this could be related is more. I saw a stat that recently said teams passed to their running backs more against Seattle more than any other team in the league.
Weird.
So it's like swing pass central. That's like the only way to beat this team because you're not throwing it deep like often, right? Because their defensive backs are so good,
right?
You're not necessarily throwing it over the middle a whole lot because they've got really good coverage linebackers in Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright.
I mean, it makes sense when why teams like the Packers and the Broncos get so frustrated playing the Seahawks, because their strength is on the outside. Whereas, unfortunately, when you play the Patriots, when they've got Julian Edelman and Rob Gronkowski as their top targets and receivers that aren't traditional players to defend against, it becomes more difficult for Seattle to do their strength.
Yeah.
Did you
look at the Chargers too? Remember when they played the Chargers? They had Danny Woodhead, and he had a really big game. I want to say, just on the outside. So
yeah, for playing the Eagles this year, maybe that's something that's going to be a tough one as well. Talking about Darren Sproles and just the sheer amount. Ryan Matthews DeMarco Murray and then Brent Selleck and Zach Ertz. That's going to be perhaps one of the sleepers in the NFC this season.
Yeah, definitely. And so it'll be interesting to see where their sack numbers go this year, though.
Yeah, I mean, if Frank Clark is, Frank Clark is a player that Rob Staten thought was, potentially if he didn't have those issues, a top 10 pick in terms of just talent, that there wasn't that much of a difference physically between him and Jadeveon Clowney. So that's pretty high praise. Maybe me and Rob have a podcast coming up, just a little sneak preview there, because we do like to talk. We have good conversations about prospects, but just transitioning there, me and Danny had a good conversation with a pretty much still a prospect. As alluded to earlier, we spoke to Douglas McNeil III. The Seahawks picked him up last December after a tryout, put him on the practice squad. Prior to that, he was briefly on the Denver Broncos, speak of the devil, on their practice squad. Had a rough go from high school to get to the NFL, had a stop in the Arena League, playing down in Portland, and before that was at Bowie. It's Bowie State, right?
I think so, yeah.
Playing at Bowie State for 3 years, but that was his fourth college since coming out of high school. At one point, you'll hear that he actually played flag football just so that he could continue playing football while he was ineligible. And as you can imagine, dominated flag football. So let's hear that conversation with Douglas McNeil III right now. The Seahawks play their first preseason game this week against the Denver Broncos. Preseason games, as usual, a opportunity for some of the lesser-known guys to show what they got, and we've learned a lot that on this Seahawks team with Pete Carroll, everybody has a legitimate chance to make the final 53-man roster, and especially we've seen at the wide receiver position and coming out of that group, a lot of undrafted free agents, a lot of guys that were lesser known and are now well known. One of these guys that is on the team now and making a name for himself over the offseason has had one of the most unbelievable journeys to get to this point of being on an NFL team and, making it this far, having gone through a number of colleges before finally landing at Bowie State and sticking there for a while, going undrafted, going to the Arena League where he was a star for Portland, and now trying to make the Seahawks and realize his dream of becoming an NFL player, and that's Douglas McNeil III, and we're talking to him today. How are you, Douglas?
I'm doing good, man. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. I want to start right now with the present, which is the news that came this week that you were taking reps at cornerback and at defensive back. Can you sort of elaborate on that switch, and is this something that looks like it's going to be permanent?
Just off my, my size and my speed. Me and Coach had a conversation. He was telling me about a player that played both sides, and it was like a funny story that we were just talking about, and he was just saying how that was cool. And he asked me if I played defense in high school, and I played defense in high school. I was a DN, a D tackle, and a free safety. So, I've been on the defensive side of the ball. So, with my size, he felt like I would be able to, play that position too, because of the advantage I have, size-wise in the NFL. So we just went ahead and played with it. And as you can see, I've been over there for the past 2 days taking reps. And it's really not too hard of a switch because it's just me thinking the opposite of what I'm used to doing. But
right. So is this the first time that it's ever been brought up? Like, was it ever sort of toyed with? Because so when you worked out for the Seahawks last December and they signed you to the practice squad, you were already a very, you fit the mold very nicely of a tall, long, and fast. So was this the first time where you caught off by surprise a little bit?
Not. I wouldn't say I was caught by surprise, but with the size and the speed that I have, it wouldn't, be, far ahead of it not being something that could be. Like Sherman, Sherman played receiver when he was at Stanford, and he converted to DB.
Yeah.
And, you know, we kind of had that same build. And, you know, a guy with his size and what he can do, you know, it's just a simulation of myself, you know, being in his situation. So,
do you think they're going to –
some of the
go ahead.
The pointers that he's been giving me has been helpful, you know, just to adapt.
Do you think that they're going to have you try playing receiver as well as the preseason goes on, or are you going to mostly focus on DB now?
It could possibly be both, you know, but all we know from now is that I'm taking snaps for the defense, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
What was the hardest thing?
If I'm on defense come Friday, then I'll be rolling.
Okay. Well, what's been the hardest thing in the whole transition? I mean, obviously, the Seahawks have talked about how they kind of have an intricate technique for their corners, the step kick. Has it been a real challenge to learn that press technique and kind of like how the Seahawks do their you know, how their cornerbacks play?
Well, to never have played cornerback ever, like within my first 2 days, I kind of picked up quick.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's just what I'm used to going against. I'm now using it, you know, on the other side of the ball. So once, you know, I learned how the line of scrimmage works, you know, everything else will pretty much play into my advantage. So,
yeah, and
you know, just staying over the top, taking away the deep ball, and then once you know have the little things, then you're able to play a little better with them trying to get to you now.
Do you think that your experience in an offense helps you in terms of recognizing, you know, route combinations and like the way that people are set up in terms of their alignments and things like that?
Very much so. Very much so. Like I use the cues that I would actually do myself, you know.
Interesting.
And use it in a DB mindset. So I'm able to pick on a little bit quicker because, like I said, I've played defense before. So, like, I understand coverages.
Mm-hmm.
You know, being on offense, you have to be able to understand, you know, coverages. So now it's just on the other side, I just have to know my assignment just to be able to carry it out effectively.
When you were signed by Seattle last December and were with the wide receiver group, was there a particular player that you sort of emulated or, you know, followed or watched or became close to that you could learn from? Because obviously, like I said before, there's a number of guys on this team, Ricardo Lockett, Chris Matthews, that were undrafted free agents that, you know, not a lot of people gave a chance. And, you know, both of them had, you know, big moments in the Super Bowl. And so was there a certain player that you followed or got close to or not?
Well, I just kind of follow, like the saying kind of goes like, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So like with Doug and Locke and Kurt and Chris and Kevin and Paul, like what everybody brings to the table, like we have an aggressive mindset. So like it's easy to adapt, you know, when you're around an individual that are much like yourself. So I kind of, you know, like just been close in contact with all of the guys. Cause, like I said, like our receiver group, like I feel like we all are good and we all have good chances. So
yeah, it's a very
each other's lives.
Yeah, it's a very deep and eclectic group. A lot of different guys. A lot of praise as well for the rookie Ty Lockett. Can you sort of talk about what you've seen from Ty as he works his way into the group?
Oh yeah, Ty, very, very good at what he does. Very shifty, very quick, and he definitely has a speed advantage. And he's been able to adapt fast, you know, pick up on the offense and make some good plays out there.
You talked about how you played safety and defensive end in high school. So obviously having that experience is going to be big in terms of, you know how to tackle and things like that. Do you think, do the Seahawks have a different technique or do they teach a different technique than what you've been taught growing up? And how hard has that transition been in terms of the tackling aspect of it?
Yes, they do teach a better technique. But with the way that the game has adapted, the tackling must adapt as well. So
yeah.
The technique that they do teach, it's effective while you can still be aggressive at the same time. It's just understanding, you know, the points of emphasis where it comes to contact. So I'm like, I already know how to tackle, like already. But just learning with better technique will only put you in advantage just
Right.
making the right tackles.
How did you feel about the mock game on Saturday and how you played? Did you have any moments that stood out above the rest?
Pretty much the play I was pretty good. I was out there for a good bit of the plays. Just being able to go through it live with the different coverages and just getting used to it, getting a feel. I guess pretty good. I was able to fly around. It's kind of hard because you can't be as aggressive, but just still being close to your assignments and running down on the catches. It was still good, to say the least.
I want to go back because, like I said, you have a very, very interesting backstory, and you fought through a lot to get to this point. You accepted a scholarship to Virginia Tech at first. Were you getting? Can you sort of describe like your offers that you were getting in high school, what the experience was like during recruitment process, and then ultimately, ending up at James Madison before a small stop at community college, and then finally winding up at Bowie State?
Well, yeah, it's a long road, but I try to touch on these parts. But coming out of high school, I had 3 schools that were offering me scholarships. James Madison University, the University of Virginia, and Virginia Tech. My junior year at Newtown High School, I went to a camp that the Hokies were having for some of their recruits. And it was a 3-day camp. The wide receiver coach, he took interest in me, so I went up there. So within those 3 days, I pretty much got my scholarship there. Met with Frank Beamer, and we worked out everything. So I ended up signing with them, but my grades didn't allow me to leave at the fall. So it was kind of like a gray shirt. So I was going to come there in the spring, and in the meantime, I would still work on my SAT scores. So when I got the scores, I missed the deadline to start school, and I would have had to wait an additional semester. So the young NC kid I was back then, I was ready to play. And I know James Madison has showed a lot of interest in me as well. So I talked to Mickey Matthews, and we worked it out that they, transitioned, and they ended up signing me in the spring. Was at JMU for 2 years. And then after 2 years, my redshirt freshman year, I was left ineligible. So I transferred. But in order to transfer, I had to, take some classes over, get in the right credits to certain schools. So I went to Catonsville Community College in Baltimore. And I was there for a year out of football. And then once I transferred back into Bowie State, I would have been a rising junior, but losing a year and sitting out a year, Bowie only took me as a sophomore, which gave me the 3 years of eligibility I was going to use there. So coming out of Bowie State, didn't really have a high draft grade, kind of under the radar. Didn't have a pro day, actually. So with a lot of that, Wayne, it was like a realistic view, but at the end of the day, me and my agent, we knew what plan A was. But, sometimes, you don't get plan A. So we were all the way down to our plan C. I did a few combines, CFL hosted, did pretty good out there. Ended up getting signed into an IFL league by the Tri-City Fever. And about 4 days later, the Portland Thunder got my rights from them, and I ended up going to Portland Thunder, the new arena team in 2014, where I was there for a year. I actually got hurt during the season and tore my plantar fascia on my left foot. I was out for 6 weeks, so that was a big blow as well. But I was able to come back, and in the last 3-4 games of the season, to help us go to the playoffs. So we actually went to the playoffs our first year. So, but that was a good year in Portland. So, with the success that, coming off of that season, I had to work out with the Broncos. I was with them for 3 weeks. I was released. Then I had to work out with the Seahawks. And they kept me ever since. And, that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and at one point, when you weren't able to play football and you weren't eligible to, you had to sit out because you had transferred, you played flag football just so that you could keep in shape and keep just sort of keep playing football. I think you might be one of the first players. I mean, for anyone to be now, working to get into the NFL, and their first actual year of college football was flag football. It's pretty amazing. Can you sort of, at any point, did you ever once consider like giving up football?
Not at all. Like when your mind is set and when you really know what you want to do, you even when you're not being a part of it, you're still going to be very much a part of it. So like that year that I was out of football, like it was a very humbling experience for me. Like just coming out of the schools that I came out of and the opportunities. So like that year that I didn't have football, like it really made me sit back and, put things into perspective and start to reevaluate things. So, like you said, like to stay in shape and, like to still work on my craft because, football is a year-long sport.
Yeah.
Like you kind of stay ready so you don't have to get ready. So in the meantime, I played in different flag leagues, different tournaments, and played in different places just to sharpen my game as well and to still have that hunger. So when it was time to get back in, I would never miss a step.
I assume you dominated the flag football league.
Oh, yeah. Tournaments back to back. In the league back home where, like, when I go out, like, I'm recognized, like, people know because, like, the last, like, I've been playing, like, flags for, like, a good, 3-4 years. So it's like I've been building my game as well as playing at Bowie State. So, like, those years really kind of helped me fine-tune my skills, so to speak. So I was always, fresh and on it.
There's a highlight video from your time in the AFL that's been going around circulating with Seahawks fans and generated a lot of buzz about you just because of some of the acrobatic plays that you made and sort of the explosive style that you have. What are some of the skills that you have in terms of receiver that translate really well to corner? Because the first thing that come to my mind would be just body control. But are there other skills that transfer over really pretty easily for you?
Yes. As you said, being able to play the ball.
Yeah.
Very important, at the wide receiver or DB position. So my size as well. 6'3", 6'4". I'm about 212, 215. 212 right now.
Okay.
That size advantage against, some of the bigger receivers or smaller receivers, and then my arm reach as well. So like I'm pretty lengthy, and I rely heavily on my speed as I would at wide receiver. So I trust myself to always stay over the top. So once you're able to key in on certain techniques, then I can just play the ball as I would at the receiver position when the ball's in the air. So
yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I can just picture, Richard Sherman. He does his trail technique, and then as soon as he, sees the receiver turn, he goes up and just plays the ball like a receiver. And I think that's a big part of, what Pete Carroll sees in the whole transition. The willingness to, play players on both sides of the ball. So, yeah, that's definitely an interesting way of going about it. What are some of the things about Seahawks practices that are unique to you?
I just love our tempo. When I first came here, like it probably took me about, I'm gonna say like 2 weeks to really, adjust to the tempo of how the NFL is run, and then on top of that, how the Seahawks practice. So it's a certain tempo, that, not staying in the game, you can't really simulate, the contact that you would get from the game, but the speed and everything else is pretty much the same.
Wow.
And you want to keep that tempo. And as I said, like it's a certain tempo that we have. So that's like, it keeps you going. Like your mindset is you have on shoulder pads, you have on helmet. No, you're not going to really destroy your teammates because, it would be smart, but we're still out there competing, and everything is about competing.
When you
you got good,
I was just going to ask, when you switch over to the defensive side of the ball, I think people saw on the live feed of practice that you're getting coached up by Chris Richard. What do you think of Richard as a coach?
Oh, He's a real good coach. It's just funny, you know. Just a few days ago, I was on the opposite side, and we were going at each other. So now, like, actually been on the same side. Like, he's been real helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Again, he keys and identifies with, you know, some of the advantages that I may have. So he gives me the information that I need to know so I could just go out there and play. The transition, it's been quick, but as the days have went on, you know, I'm able to pick up on something more and more each day. So, you know, at the mock game, I was out there, you know, probably a good 20 snaps. So I'm able to get those live action reps in, you know, to be able to help sharpen my skills heading into the preseason. You know, because once the game starts, you know, everything else is just full on.
Yep.
You know, but until then, everything is pretty much mental, staying, you know, heavy on your assignment. So he's definitely playing a big part in it.
There's one of the things that Pete Carroll and John Schneider have really been known for since coming to Seattle in 2010 is, you know, a lot of roster movement, a lot of transactions, you know, perhaps the most in the league. You know, there's a term that a lot of Seahawks writers would use saying churn, and that they move players around a lot, but then they bring them right back. Is there any sort of conversations that you have with the front office or with Pete Carroll in terms of just, hey, we really like you, even if, you know, there's a moment where we have to let you go, like, we really like you and we're going to keep him around? How do they keep that sort of atmosphere around where you feel, you know, comfortable, even though at the same time there are 90 guys fighting for 53 jobs?
Pretty much. Like, those conversations, like, they pretty, what I could say, like, as far as my level, the only thing that I'm really concerned of and that I do, I just make sure that I go out there every day, you know, that I make the team mindset-wise, you know, for all the talks, you know, because anybody can say anything. But at the end of the day, I just want to make sure that my play will always speak for itself. So, you know, like, some of those conversations may come in time.
One of the things, you know, that Pete Carroll talks about a lot, and we've heard him, you know, speak about in the press a lot, is grit. And I think, you know, just your story, your background, just is a really great example of that, like the resilience in the face of adversity and keeping at it even when you had to transfer and do things like that. Has Pete Carroll talked to you about that in particular?
Like, he's brought it up from time to time. We actually had a presentation on grit, you know, like, just like what it means. And yes, my story, it definitely emphasizes a lot in that, and, like, just my mentality on the field itself. So, you know, as a team, I feel like we definitely, you know, have that grit, and we use that.
It is interesting, like, as you were saying before, going against Chris Richard and then fighting, and then obviously being coached by him directly. Like, I assume that while the whole team is a family, at the same time, when you're out there on the field going up every day as a receiver against these cornerbacks, and then you switch over, like, is it just a seamless transition as you go into a new group with a new position coach?
It's been pretty cool. Just the camaraderie among the team. And, you know, each and every day we're out there, you know, going to compete. So, you know, the transition over, you know, it's just, everybody's just been helpful, you know, saying that, you know, I'm able to still come over and still compete at a high level. You know, so everybody will pitch in, you know, like, they see something or like a helpful hint, that they definitely come aboard and help on with that.
You know, you came up on the East Coast and you spent some time in Portland playing in the Arena League, and now you're in Seattle. What do you think of the Northwest?
I'm definitely loving the Northwest. Coming from Baltimore, you know how it's a big difference, you know, in the West Coast life. This is Portland was actually the first, you know, place I've been to on the West Coast.
Oh yeah.
You know, and then with Seattle following up, I'll say my West Coast treatment hasn't been too bad.
Awesome.
There's no baseball team, no NFL team in Portland. Does that make the arena team, like, very popular and a really good rabid fan base?
You know, it was actually good to see how we were able to pull on so many people in the community as fast as we did. a lot of people didn't even know what arena football was when they brought it to Portland. So I feel like the fan base that we were able to build that like within that 1 year, like was actually what made the experience what it was with the AFL league already being as family oriented as it is already, So it was
Do you
pretty
have
good.
a favorite place to eat in Portland? Favorite places to go?
I had a bunch of them. Whatever was the name on the voucher that I had. So it was many of them.
Awesome.
When you did your tryout with the Seahawks last December, what do you think the coaches liked the most? Was it just, the size and speed aspect, or was there any one particular thing that you thought went especially well during your tryout?
I would say, I guess the fact that when I'm out there, I only know one speed. And as I said, like once I learned the tempo of how practice was, the one thing that I do, pride myself and my game on is my speed. My motor is just going to be a little bit higher than, the person in front of me or the person that's going to be going against me. So, the fact that I just go out there and I treat every day as the day that it is, to make sure that I make the team every day. So when the day is over, I know that I've done everything that I was supposed to do. So
absolutely,
that works for me.
All right, yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. Want to thank Douglas McNeil III for coming on to Real in the Field of Goals podcast. Really looking forward to seeing you out there in the preseason and wishing you the best of luck as the cuts are made down to the final 53. All right, so that was our conversation with Douglas McNeil III. Any final thoughts on that talk, Danny?
No, I just, it makes it really interesting I think he's one of the top guys to watch on Friday. I think hopefully they'll get him in there for a lot of snaps, and I actually hope they'll play him at receiver a little bit too. I don't know if they're planning on doing that, as he said, but he's going to be one of the most interesting players to watch this week in the next couple of weeks. And I just rooting for him. It was cool to hear about all the stuff that he had to go through to get to the league, and the whole grit factor. I think people. That's like a living example of that, like in terms of, he's playing flag football just to stay competing and going to the Arena League and going all over the place and trying to stick with it. And now he's accepting a position change, and they're just, it was just a cool conversation, and we'll be looking forward to watching him.
Yeah, I can personally attest to how difficult it is to watch preseason football games. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm not a true fan, but I don't really care to watch preseason football games that much. Unless it's the Seahawks, you have to have something invested. And then usually especially in these first weeks, when you're getting into the second half of the game, it's just not the football that you're used to seeing at a professional level. It's just the fact of the matter. But when you have a guy like Douglas McNeil, I think Field Goals fans, people that have been following this blog, especially this year, have two guys to root for in Douglas McNeil, because he was so gracious as to come onto the podcast, and he's just a great story and interesting guy, and probably Christian Sicoli, just based on obviously Zach Whitman's Spark rating him as the highest Spark player ever recorded, and also and then I did do an interview with him for Rolling Stone. If you missed that, I guess search it out on
We can
Google.
throw that on the post here.
Yeah, so I would root for Sicoli and definitely check him out, and then also Douglas McNeil III. And I'm sure there's a couple other guys to keep an eye on. This Friday, Denver Broncos in Seattle. And then, once that game's happening, hopefully everyone's healthy and we'll have a lot better idea. When would you expect the next edition of the 53-man roster prediction?
I think I'll try and do it Monday or Tuesday, so we can. We'll definitely be able to discuss it again next week.
Okay, so there you go. Another roster prediction. There's probably, just based on one game, you'll probably get a couple changes.
Yeah.
And that happens. So thanks for listening to Reel in the Field Goals, presented to you by the Ballard Agency. Again, go to theballardagency.com. Give them a call and tell them that Field Goals sent you, so they know that this podcast advertising is working quite well. I know we got thousands of good listeners out there. So, again, theballardagency.com for insurance needs. And follow at Field Goals, at Kenneth Arthur S. What do you remember what Douglas McNeil's Twitter is?
Hold on.
It's not something that would be. It's not something like Douglas McNeil III or anything even close. It's like a nickname.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have. I didn't even know. I had a hard time finding him myself. I was surprised that you were able to.
Something. We'll throw it up. We'll throw it up on the blog page.
Throw it up on the blog page. So then you have to make sure you go to fieldgoals.com. Follow us. Subscribe to our show on iTunes. And perhaps look out for more Field Goals podcasts in the future coming this season. So thanks again for listening, and come back next week. We'll be talking about the game against the Broncos and the next week's game against whoever it's against. So see you next week.
All righty.